let me tell you at first that this is an original research that I carried out. It was part of this summary of this, maybe 20 pages of this, were published in Italy last week in Vilnius, the Geopolitical Review in Italy, which, as geopolitics goes, sells 20,000 issues per number, which is astounding in academic terms. But there you go. This is Italy for you, one of the surprises that Italy brings for you. And there is nothing written on the degradation of the security situation in the South Atlantic. There will be now. I will publish this, hopefully, and I'll be able to publish this even in Lithuanian in translation. That's depends on me. I certainly publish it in the Portuguese Ministry of Defense. And as I said, the summary of this has been published in Italy. So all you're going to hear is probably new. And as a tribute to Margarita, I decided to organize this in a very special way. Rather than talk simply, which I will also do, about the degradation of the empirical situation as far as security and the lack of a security architecture is concerned in the South Atlantic, I'm also going to be talking about the discursive construction of insecurity in this area. So I will be quoting decision makers from a variety of places in the world in relation to what they perceive as the security and defense degradation of the situation in the South Atlantic. Now, you have a map here, and let me show you very briefly what I'm going to be talking about. This, I think, is of some interest. I'm not having a pointer, I have this, which will allow me to read up there. The general area of jurisdiction of NATO passes along north of this line. This is NATO, up there. In other words, this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Notice it's not called the Euro-American Alliance or the Eurasian North American Alliance. It's focused on the North Atlantic Sea basin, reflecting new geopolitical realities, as I shall argue. Post-World War, in this case, Second World War, as I shall argue, is ever more the case. What I will call the South Atlantic, for purposes of exposition here, is the entire area south of this line, i.e. the area that goes south of the US border and south of the entrance to the Mediterranean, all the way southwards. Now this area, although it's not represented in the map, and I couldn't find a map that did have that, and I didn't have the time to draw it on top of one of the maps, which I could have done. I just didn't. This is a particularly interesting area. As you may, some of you may be aware, somewhere in the middle runs the so-called Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where the continents are breaking, separating, where the Atlantic is, well, this is high-tech. Where the Atlantic
the other way around is high-tech.
Where the Atlantic is being opened. Now, this is the line I was talking about. That's the area of jurisdiction of the North Atlantic, NATO. And that's the empty area that I'll be talking about. This empty area, rim-wise, continentally-wise, includes the Caribbean, the Sargasso Sea, includes South America, includes West Africa, and includes what doesn't show up in the map, because it's over here, Antarctica. Now, let me give you a few pinpoints so that you know what I'm talking about. In the North Atlantic, the jurisdictional area of NATO, there's one, at least, diacritical geopolitical point, which is along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge that I talked about, which is somewhat there. It's an archipelago, Portuguese, called the Azores, which is used as a stepping stone, was used as a stepping stone first by the Brits, then by the Americans, during the Second World War for their shipping, and that the Germans decided to conquer it so that their U-boats, the submarines, would be able to use the Atlantic and sink the convoys that the Allies were sending through the Atlantic. Effectively was de facto occupied by the Brits and the Americans, who established huge bases there, with Salazar, the Portuguese dictator's acceptance at the time, and they're still there, the Americans, in NATO. This is about here. There's another archipelago, which is about there, called Madeira. Some of you will know about the wine in Madeira and about the holidays in Madeira. And of course, right near it, there is the Canary Islands, which are, Madeira is Portuguese, the Canary Islands are Spanish. What you probably don't know is that in this area, this is latitude 40. This is where the so-called roaring 40s, the Elysian winds, made it easier for the Atlantic crossings. Along this area, there's two Portuguese-speaking archipelagos. One, which is about here, called Cape Verde, Cabo Verde. Cape Verde is Barlavento and Sotavento, two sets of islands, but in fact it's three sets of islands. It's Portuguese-speaking, and there has been, and I'll come back to this again, the suggestion by a Bulgarian in 2006, by the then Bulgarian Solomon Pasi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, that Cabo Verde becomes a full-fledged member of NATO. This was not accepted, namely by Greece. I'm a friend of Solomon's. Solomon's then ran for Secretary General of NATO, and he became the head of the Parliamentary Commission in Sofia in Bulgaria for Security and Defense. He has a new project on that I'm not at ease to talk about because he invited me into it, which involves this as well. This Cabo Verde is absolutely essential because, as you can see, it's the funnel connection. It's in a sentinel position between the North and the South Atlantic. Any ships or any submarines or any planes or any troop carriers who want to move down, up, or up, down, will have to face off eventual troops that are in the potential fortress here in Cabo Verde. There's a second one, which is here, off the coast of Nigeria and Gabon, called São Tomé e Príncipe. Again, a Portuguese-speaking archipelago, which sits right on the equator. The equator actually cuts in two, notionally of course, one of the islands, small islet in São Tomé e Príncipe. Moreover, so I talked about Portugal is here, of course, the Azores, Madeira, Cape Verde, São Tomé e Príncipe, and of course this is Angola. Portuguese-speaking country, as you know as well. And this is Brazil. 200 million strong Portuguese-speaking country. Now, this right here, 5 or 6 years ago, the second biggest oil reserves in the world were discovered, Pré-Sal, off the coast of São Paulo, the biggest city. Not only demographically, but economically, the generator, the motor of Brazil. São Tomé e Príncipe has a lot of oil. The estimate now is that it has as much oil as Angola does. Something at the level of 14 trillion barrels of oil. That will put them both among the 10 biggest oil-producing areas in the world. And of course, the Niger Delta in Nigeria is known for the amount of oil it has. Time's up, doesn't it? The amount of oil it has which makes it very important. Now, there's an international treaty, I'm sure you've heard of, the Montego Bay Treaty, signed in the 70s in Jamaica, for not only territorial waters, but jurisdictional waters as far as the security and defense is concerned, and economic exclusive zones, as it was defined. Now, this is being redefined now, refined now, in a way, so that claims are being stated, put forward, and settled eventually within 2 years. By 2012, the process is due to be over. In fact, by the end of 2011, for claims for territorial waters from all countries in the world. Portugal, because of its coast over there, no, this doesn't work. Because of its coast over there, and because of the insular platforms along the Azores, which are about this big, and because of Madeira, which is about this big, and because of compensation mechanisms predicted in the treaty, the Montego Bay Treaty with Spain, because there's overlapping areas, because Portugal, of course, only has 2 borders, Spain and the sea. Now, the border that Portugal has with Spain, there's collusive economic zones here, which both countries claim. So there's a mechanism of compensation for this, so that we're given, and so are they, sea areas beyond that, which makes Portugal, makes it so that Portugal will have the 2nd biggest territorial water area in the Atlantic, and I think the 5th biggest in the world, because of the islands that we have. Brazil, because of the deposits from the Amazon here, has a huge platform there, and a huge one here, and it's negotiating for an even bigger one. And Cape Verde has a huge one there, because it's 3 nexus of islands, as I told you. São Tomé has a huge one there, negotiated with Nigeria, with a joint exploration zone as well as its own exploration zone, and Angola as well, although this is still to be discussed. Now, let me make an initial point about this, which is a point which is neither here nor there as far as this argument is concerned. It's important for Portugal, politics-wise, policy-wise. It's not very important for you, but it's certainly important for NATO. It's certainly important for the creation of an eventual creation, as you shall see, of a security architecture in this area, which badly needs one. The main language spoken in the southern hemisphere, worldwide. The southern hemisphere, as you can see here, thins out, and geographically. Look at South America, it becomes thinner, leaner as it goes down. Look at Africa, so does it. On the other side of the world, of course, you have the Pacific Ocean, which has huge islands, from New Guinea, which is the 5th biggest island in the world, to the biggest, arguably, island in the world. Of course, then the American continent is an island. Mackinder did this, McMahon did this, the big geopoliticians. But the biggest island that's been decided is Australia. New Zealand are in the south as well. It's pretty much just sea all around. The first language in the southern hemisphere is Portuguese, world over. Second, because of Brazil, of course, and Angola with about 20 million people, and Mozambique with 20 more million people. Second language in the south as a whole is English. The third is Spanish, because of Latin America. Now, if we focus on the South Atlantic, the panorama is slightly different. The first language is Portuguese, almost double the second, which is Spanish. Third language is English, mostly because of Nigeria and South Africa. But remember, Brazil has 200 million people. Look at it in another way, which is of interest to us, not to you, but to you as NATO members, so to us all. Of the 8 Portuguese-speaking countries in the world, 5 are in the South Atlantic. Only 3 are not, namely Portugal is not, it's in the North Atlantic, East Timor where I just came from last month, which is on the Pacific, and Mozambique, which is on the Indian Ocean. All others are in the South Atlantic. And if you look at this, as we will be able to when it's settled who gets what territorial waters, the South Atlantic is blurs of Portuguese-speaking controlled areas under our jurisdiction, our Portuguese-speaking people's jurisdictions, and then the rest. There's 2 tunnels, one on the right, which is international waters, and another one on the left, which is international waters. All the rest is this. Now, historically, the South Atlantic has been very interesting. Historically, it was quite literally a backwater. It was a backwater in the sense that everything happened in the North Atlantic. This is, again, if this functioned, I could show you, it doesn't. This is where the, this is where the Hanseatic League functioned, as you know, including Bergen there in Norway. This is where trade took place. Then trade started taking place from the 16th century onwards, there, with the Americas. Fishing there, both the Nordic countries had started going there, and then Portugal and Spain started going there. And then in 1500, putatively for the first time, although there's doubt if it was for the first time, Portugal went to Brazil. And then the Spaniards followed to the rest of Latin America. This is why they speak Spanish and Portuguese. In other words, suddenly Portugal also went here, which of course the Pope gave to Portugal when he divided the world into 2, the line passed there. Everything to that side was Portuguese, everything to that side was Spanish. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, that the Pope signed with the 2 kings, the Castilian king and the Portuguese king. The line went there. It was moved because the Portuguese wanted to make sure that Brazil was in. Brazil was not discovered yet, formally. But we obviously knew because we negotiated to get it, I mean, in Portugal. The interesting thing is, of course, when we started creating points here, fortifications, for trade with the interior of Africa, and we started to settle here for trade with the interior of South America, big plantations with slave labor were installed that created what historians call the triangular commerce, which is this triangle. Mostly with the Hanseatic League, or what remained of the Hanseatic League. So the South Atlantic, because of this commerce, became important, but it remained important for not very long. Spain took over Portugal, the enemies of Spain became the enemies of Portugal. Britain and Holland took over Portuguese interests here, namely Brazil, and here, namely Angola. This is why you have the Dutch Guyanas, the British Guyanas, and the French Guyanas from that time. It lasted for 60 years, it stopped in 1640. When it stopped in 1640, trade resumed. But the trade that resumed there was a very special trade. In the 15th century, Vasco da Gama, whom I'm sure you have heard of, discovered the sea routes to India, that way. Suez Canal didn't exist yet, so he went that way for the first time. When he went that way, Arnold Toynbee, for instance, the historian, divides world history in the pre-Gamic phase and the post-Gamic phase. Pre-Gamma and post-Gamma, this was a tectonic change in international trade and international relations. Now, this meant that the South Atlantic became very important as a trade route. It also meant that the South Atlantic became prey to pirate attacks, anti-trade route, if you want, kind of anti-globalization version in the Renaissance of recent movements. And this continued. Throughout 17th, 18th, 19th century, the South Atlantic became ever more and more important. Until, of course, the Suez Canal was opened when the Suez Canal was opened, the South Atlantic blinked out of existence, as it were. This coincided with the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, in which the South Atlantic was of no importance. In fact, the decline of the South Atlantic with steamships and with ships that were heavily protected, and with navies, mostly the British Navy, and then the French Navy protecting, and the Dutch Navy protecting the South, with the independence of ex-colonies. The Spanish colonies in the Americas became independent in the beginning of the 19th century. Brazil became independent in 1822, the beginning of the 19th century. So we had navies, European and South American countries had navies patrolling all the Atlantic, so piracy became unimportant. So the South Atlantic faded back into oblivion, because boats moved here, and either crossed there, or very often went to the Caribbean and then crossed over the North Atlantic using the Azores and Madeira and the Canary Islands as stepping stones. So this declined in importance, slowly, so it became what I like to call the Atlantic elsewhere, the other Atlantic, which is very graphically, I think, made clear by the fact that the second time that Napoleon was exiled, when he was thrown out finally, it wasn't to Elba anymore. After Waterloo, he was thrown to St. Helena. St. Helena, of course, is in the South Atlantic. It was beyond sunset, as it were. It was no man's land. No way he could get away from that, from there. Now, it's actually very interesting because there was an attempt to get him out from there. Jean Mendelssohn, who's the director of the National Archives of France, gave me during the Portuguese presidency, the third Portuguese presidency of the European Union, amazing information, which I didn't know about. They decided in 2006, after the student upheavals in Paris, where cars were burned and whatever, they decided to move a variety of state things north of Paris. And the reason why they placed state institutions there was for decentralization or deconcentration. The real reason, I was told, was because they wanted to place security forces there without alienating people, claiming that they were there to protect the university. It was Securitas private enterprises. Well, all, I think, 120 linear kilometers of archives that France has had to be moved, and he digitalized them. As he had them digitalized, he discovered a court case. We're in 1815. A group of officers, pro-Napoleonic officers, decided to go and liberate Napoleon and bring him back again. And they bought from the Americans a prototype submarine. And we're going from a Recife in Brazil on a ship with an iron submarine. And the idea was to go to St. Helena and get Napoleon out. They were caught, tried, and hanged. And the documents are the documents from the French consul in Brazil recounting this history. Wouldn't this be a wonderful movie? Wouldn't you want to watch this movie, the attempt to liberate Napoleon in the South Atlantic? Now, the South Atlantic, again, became unimportant during the Second World War throughout the 20th century, until, of course, in the 80s, it reacquired importance because of the conflict in the South Atlantic over resources and over national status right here in the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas, where the Argentinians and the British fought each other off. It was very easy. There was a military dictatorship in Argentina, as there was in Brazil at that time. It was very easy for the Argentinian Navy to go over. Argentina has a huge navy because A, it has a lot of islands there, and B, it has a huge chunk of territory down there in Antarctica. So the Argentinian military sent their warships and submarines, took over the Falkland Islands, and Mrs. Thatcher in London, the Iron Lady, decided to move down. She had no chance in hell. But there's an archipelago right here called Ascension Island, which has prepositions, huge stockpiles of American weapons. And the Americans allowed the Brits to use those weapons and also gave them satellite data on the position of Argentine ships, so Britain won the war. So the South Atlantic became central suddenly again in the 80s of last century. As you see, the South Atlantic, and it's becoming important now for reasons I'll be talking about today. So as you see, the centrality in the sense of the geopolitical importance of the South Atlantic has to and fro's, has had progressions and regressions, but at a macro level, the overall movement has been of an increase in the importance and centrality of the South Atlantic. This importance and centrality of the South Atlantic comes in tandem, of course, with the political and military importance that the South Atlantic has acquired. Let me give you two bullets about this political importance. In the 1950s, Camilo Torres, Catholic father, organized over there in Colombia a guerrilla movement that decided to export its ideology to Africa and to Latin America as a whole. It worked in Cuba. And in Cuba, Fidel Castro had a young man who decided to go to the Congo and then to Angola. What was his name? Raimundo? Che Guevara, who decided to organize fighting there, communist insurgencies there. This culminated, of course, in the New York agreements of 1990, when there were taken away from Angola 50,000 Cuban soldiers plus 5,000 Soviet military advisors who were actually occupying Angola there, helping the government against an insurgent movement who was backed by South Africa with apartheid and the Americans. In other words, the military situation linking the two sides of the Atlantic has degraded or ignited itself in the mid-20th century, and it culminated at the end of the 20th century in 1990. And then it appeared to dissipate, but it really didn't. Bolivarianism has restarted now. And Bolivarianism, in fact, as I told some of you, your students, most of them, is actually not a Latin American movement. Bolivarianism is in Venezuela, it's in Colombia, it's in Bolivia, it's in Ecuador, it's in Cuba, arguably, it's in Nicaragua, it's in the Caribbean. It's in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. It's not really a pan-Latin American movement. It's localized in a particular area, and this has created a lot of trouble for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons being, of course, that this entire area is becoming a kind of center of gravity for narco-traffic. As you know, it started with Colombia, right there. After Colombia, it spread to Mexico, right here. Then it started in Nigeria, north of the west coast of Africa, where it's still going. And it was smashed on last week, as I speak, in Brazil, in Rio, right here, in the Alemão place that the military actually invaded with tanks and everything, as you remember from last week. Now, this narco-traffic, of course, together with Afghanistan, produces the majority of drugs. We're talking about like 90% of the drugs in the world. Heroin and morphine, opiates, come mostly from Afghanistan. Cocaine and marijuana and hashish come mostly from this area of the world. This area of the world is my South Atlantic. So it's gaining a negative centrality of sorts that creates huge problems. Among other things, as you know, narco-traffickers now have submarines to transport their goods. So we're not talking about small, disorganized bands of people. Now, what was the reaction for this? What I call the geopolitization of the South Atlantic. The acquisition of a geopolitical dimension by the South Atlantic, which is mostly a 21st century, late 20th century sort of affair, is going to be the focus of what I'm going to be talking about. Now, I don't want to sound deterministic. I'm not deterministic at all in relation to these things. I think a multiplicity of factors play a role, convergent factors, which are interspersed, somehow propitiate what actually happens. I do not think that one mechanism causes whatever. I think there's more than one, and I don't think there's a causal link. But I think it propitiates, as a constraint somehow, what is going on. And let me quote a Brazilian, very renowned political commentator called Eduardo Pesce. He's of Italian ascent, which is very interesting. Something he wrote, I'll come back to this man, in 2005. And he says, I'm translating loosely from the Portuguese here, the increase on oil production in the reserves located in the sedimentary basins of the coasts of South America and Western Africa can increase the strategic importance of the South Atlantic, contributing to the reduction of dependency of the United States of America and other Western countries in relation to Middle Eastern oil. It'll be an alternative, this is what he means. Without including the potential of the pre-sal in Brazil, the second biggest reserves in the world, that were discovered a couple of years ago. The daily production, he wrote, of oil and the seas of South America can grow from 2.5 million barrels in 2005 to 6.1 barrels per million barrels per day until 2030. In other words, an increase of 144%. In the same period, the production in West Africa can go from 4.9 to 12.4 million barrels a day, an increase of 153%. In fact, these numbers were already achieved in 2010. So the increase is much bigger. The increase led to a restructuration of external trade, which is more and more dependent on oil and on sea traffic. The majority of external trade is now, well, a much bigger percentage, not the majority, a much bigger percentage of external trade is now oil and gas. And the majority of world trade is by sea. This is something I bet you didn't know. When the Soviet Union imploded in 1990, 70% of world trade was carried by sea. Now, it's 92% of world trade that is carried by sea. So now you know why piracy is resurging the world over, because it's so appetizing for pirates to go to that. Now, let me give you a few comments on this discursive construction of the insecurity of the South Atlantic, both de facto and via the statements that are made. So on the one hand, quantitative, empirical data about how much more important it's becoming and how many more troops and armies and weapons are increased there. But second, how the perception is increasing that this is becoming a very dangerous and unstable area, as a tribute to Margarita, as I said. Without any real answers being given to this. I will in fact be touching upon, and this is I think very important, the greater and greater, I already started doing this, importance of strategic resources located there. Second, the race for the South Atlantic, led by great powers, mainly outside powers, i.e. the United States, China, Russia, Great Britain, Germany, and France. Now, in the last 5 years, I'll be talking about the way they're racing for this area of the world. At the same time, as emergent powers are arising in that very same area, local or regional powers, namely Brazil, Angola, South Africa, and maybe Venezuela and Cuba. Certainly militarily, they're becoming greater powers as they're arming themselves, as you will see very quickly. I shall also be talking about the intensified competition between all these, within each of these groups and between the groups on the other hand, on the one hand, and of the proposed cooperation both between the groups and within each of these two groups. And I will be noticing all along what are the material limits to both competition and cooperation in these cases. What I'm going to be talking about is in fact the belated, delayed and heavily insufficient security architecture for a geopoliticized part of the world that is becoming ever and ever more important, which spells doom, which spells conflict, which spells rising problems. As I said, I will be talking about not only actual empirical menaces, but the perception, i.e. the construction, if you want, the securitization of these menaces. So I'll be using the terminology of Barry Buzan and Olo Weaver of the Copenhagen School, and I will also be using the Aberystwyth idea that in reality it's not only states, it's non-state actors, individuals, and in reality it's not only discursive, there is an underlying reality of difficulties. People like Ken Booth or Andrew Linklater, bibliography that your professor knows very well. I wouldn't be surprised, let me start by stating, that in a few years, when we talk about the Gulf, the referent will not be the Arabian Gulf. When we talk about the Gulf in 10 years or 5 years, my guess is we're going to be talking about the Gulf of Guinea. This is what we're going to mean when we say the Gulf. Let me give you a simple comparison showing that numbers speak for themselves. Again, general comparison here. The aggregate output of 4 million barrels a day of the production of the Gabon, Nigeria, and Angola, all of them with huge potential for growth because they have enormous reserves, is sensibly the same as the crude extracted, this is 2009 numbers, in Iran, Venezuela, and Mexico put together. So this is huge. Let me put it in another way. There are more states in the region, of course, producing hydrocarbons, namely São Tomé and Príncipe and Equatorial Guinea on the other side, on the African coast. Until 2015, the US wants to increase the current 16% consumption, domestic consumption in the US, which is originary from the South Atlantic. The US strategic plan is to increase it to 2015, this is 4.5 years ago, not even away, not even that, to 25%. In other words, they diversify. Understandably. They want 25% of the oil and gas they consume in the West to be brought from the South Atlantic and not, I repeat, not from the Middle East. Understandably. And this is a bipartisan agreement in the US, of course. Republicans as well as Democrats want that. In fact, the Republicans drill, baby, drill, want to get it from America as well, so as to depend on no one, to be self-sufficient closing in a typical oscillation of the US. Moreover, alarms have been ringing all around the South Atlantic, not only because of the export of Bolivarian revolutionary movements throughout South America, from South America to Africa, but also because the coastal areas of Africa have become hotbeds for Al-Qaeda-based radical Islamism. Non-state actors, some supranational, like Bolivarianism, some infranational, like arguably Al-Qaeda, are becoming very active in the region. Now, let me give you an idea of the importance that this has and that the South Atlantic has acquired by giving you 2005 official numbers from the US Office of Naval Intelligence. So these are not just made up numbers. The first 6 months of 2005, 7,238 ships came out of the Gulf of Guinea. In other words, 40 ships departed per day, 278 per week. This is ships going from the Gulf of Guinea to America. In this US Naval Intelligence numbers, there are oil carriers, 11 per day, in other words, 76 per week. It's not really 77, it's 76. General cargo ships, 8 per day, 56 per week. Nigeria itself, not the whole Gulf of Guinea, Raimunda's Nigeria, is the point of departure for the merchant navy from the main point of departure in the Gulf of Guinea, with 11 ships coming out per day, of which 5 are oil-carrying ships. Numbers have almost doubled since 2005. So now it's almost the double of this. So now we're talking about something like 15,000 ships for every 6 months coming out of that area. We're talking massive here. I mean, each ship, if it has containers, can carry 200,000 containers. A container is as big as a house, as you know. We're talking about very large carriers that sink to 10 meters of the water because of the weight of the containers they carry. We're talking about, I don't know what the numbers are. I remember that the numbers in 9/11 was something like 4 billion containers arriving in the US every year from all over the world. This is the 92% trade being carried by sea. So this is absolutely massive. It's unthinkable. I bet you didn't know, I didn't, that it was as big on this scale as it is. The estimate of geologists is that 8% of world reserves of crude oil are in the Gulf of Guinea. The estimate now is that something between 10 and 15% are off the coast of Brazil. The area in the Wegener maps of continental drift in the 20s and 30s, the German scientists who, avant la lettre, discovered it, of course, this fits into that. They were put together. It's being opened by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So if you have them there, well, you have them here as well. So they looked and they found them. And they were there as well. It's the same dinosaurs, and in the Carboniferous, in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, in the Carboniferous, it was the same forests creating the oil and gas in this area of the world. Now, let me talk about this now, the wake-up calls and the discursive construction of those for the South Atlantic that started in the beginning of the 21st century. Let me give you a Portuguese geopolitician, Jorge Rodrigues, talking about this. The South Atlantic, he wrote, he actually wrote this in 2002. The South Atlantic became the main maritime space, open space, which is emergent in terms of oil with logistical facilities for a rapid response from Western powers coming from the north, in particular the new hegemon, the US. It is assuming a strategic importance as an offshore platform with world significance and as an alternative corridor for delivery of hydrocarbons. Let me quote again, and this is a 2009 article from actually a good friend of mine, the Angolan General João de Matos, who was Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Angola. So he's also the third richest man in Angola. We're not talking about anybody. General João de Matos, who's the president of the Center for Strategic Studies in Luanda, the capital of Angola, wrote in 2009, although there are no great constraints, and it is considered a secondary and peripheric strategic zone, the South Atlantic worries great powers, namely the Western ones, not only individually, but also in terms of its defensive organization, NATO, the one that carries in its name North Atlantic, he wrote. It's not accidentally, again something I'll come back to this, that in 2007 the United States created the first central command created since the World War, called AFRICOM, the Africa Command, which was activated on the 1st of October 2007 as a sub-unified command. This is the official term that the Americans use for it, within the framework of EUCOM, the European Command, in Europe. And it was formally created, after de facto being created, 1 year exactly to the day afterwards, on the 1st of October 2008. It is headquartered in Stuttgart, in Germany. So we now have, in the quadricule of commands, an African command. For the only place in 1945, all of Africa, of course, was broken up into colonies of European potencies, so it was part of Europe. The Americans didn't have an African command because it was part of EUCOM. Now, since October 1, 2008, they do. In 2008, the US convinced NATO to start the first exercises in Africa, and they took place in Cape Verde. It was called Operation Steadfast Jaguar. It involved 12 countries. It involved 8,000 men and women with planes, submarines, boats, special troops, and simulated invasions of islands in the area. As they did, it was by a variety of countries. The simulation was, the majority of forces were American, British, and French.
Because usually the exercise has the...
they didn't say. Again, it's very interesting. They didn't say. It was just an occupation simulation, but they didn't say whom it was. In fact, you'll see why they didn't say, because it was a huge response. It's not the only, these are not the only steps taken discursively, on the one hand, by an Angolan general, by a Portuguese geopolitician, by the American armed forces, and NATO, on the other hand. On the 1st of July 2008, so 3 months before the formal creation of AFRICOM, or 9 months after the de facto creation of AFRICOM, on the 1st of July 2008, the American 4th Fleet, that had been created in 1943, dissolved in 1950, was reconstituted and projected to the South Atlantic. It consists of 8 main ships plus an unnamed number of submarines, and it can aggregate more ships and it was formally announced that it will aggregate to itself the biggest plane carrier the US has, one which arrived 3 days ago off the coast of North Korea, USS George Washington. So a robust presence started from NATO, the US, and the Fourth Fleet of the US in the South Atlantic. In 2008, notice the concentration of this. Perhaps more interestingly, certainly more interestingly for the reaction, for the security instability this created, it's stationed on the Mayport Naval Station in Jacksonville, Florida, and it's part of the Naval Special Warfare Command. The head of it is an American admiral, Counter Admiral Karen, who's the head of the Special Forces, the SEALs in America. So clearly this is aimed to non-state as well as for state actors. The SEALs are, if you watch American films, the tough guys. The half-covert operators who ride horses, take personal submarines, the James Bonds of the US Navy. The result was immediate and brutal. Hugo Chavez, for instance, gave a talk occupying all television, radio channels and placed in every newspaper in Venezuela immediately, accusing the South America, the North Americans, of trying to intimidate the peoples of South America by this reactivation of the Fourth Fleet, and guaranteeing that the new Sukhoi Su-20 planes that Venezuela had just acquired from Russia in 2008, end of 2008, would sink all ships and kill all American planes that dared to come close to the territorial waters of Venezuela. This is Cold War rhetoric, quite clear. Raúl Castro made a huge speech echoing this, and Fidel Castro came out from the hospital and wrote an article which he read laboriously on television, the title of which was Respuesta Hemisférica Yankee, a Yankee hemispheric response, la Cuarta Flota de Intervención, the Fourth Fleet for Intervention. This was the title Fidel gave to it. And he said, lo real es que la decisión, I'll translate, the real is that the decision to re-establish the Fourth Fleet was announced in the first week of April, almost 1 month, says Fidel, after the territory of Ecuador was attacked with bombs and technology of the United States, and under the pressure of the United States, killing and hurting citizens from very many different countries, which created an enormous repugnance among Latin American leaders. This is typical Cold War discourse, but this is 2008. The famous Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, which is an officious entity, responded in a very interesting way in 2009 by a book, which you can download when you get this. There's the link for this. You can download all of this for free, of course, by claiming that, and I'm quoting from this CSIS report, unfortunately, the benign rebranding of the US naval forces of Southcom as the Fourth Fleet, the Americans say, the benign rebranding as the Fourth Fleet, has been viewed by US friends and allies in the region with great skepticism. Adversaries of the United States, particularly heads of states such as Raúl Castro and Hugo Chavez, have been even more critical of US intentions, claiming a new era of imperialism. Not only has bad news, they wrote, has news about the Fourth Fleet attracted negative attention, it has also provided part of the rationale for the creation of the South American Defense Council CSD, under the leadership of Brazil. The negative attention that the Fourth Fleet has received is mostly a result of misinformation over why the Fourth Fleet was recreated and what its mission will be. In spite of public statements by the US military to articulate its mission, skepticism remains about the true intent behind the fleet's re-establishment. This is what Washington published. Now, in the very same page of the CSIS report, where they wrote this, there is a note which says, and it's a very interesting note, by the US Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gary Roughhead. It's a great name for an admiral, isn't it? Roughhead. I mean, which is quoted in the same page, which is saying, reconstituting the Fourth Fleet, the Admiral says, recognizes the immense importance of maritime security in the southern part of the Western Hemisphere and sends a strong signal to all the civil and military maritime services in Central and South America. Aligning the Fourth Fleet along with our other numbered fleets and providing the capabilities and personnel are a logistical execution of our new maritime strategy. You couldn't be more ambivalent and clearer than this. In the very same page where the benign fleet was created, it's pictured by the American military as a strong signal, to quote. So, interestingly, of course, other powers, and not only regional ones, started reacting to this. Let me tip off various ways in which other great powers started reacting to this. Brazil started reacting to this by, actually started this in 2005, by increasing massive migration for public works to Angola, which reached a peak of 700,000 Chinese with their families. It's now down to 400,000 or 500,000. No one really knows. The state of São Paulo in Brazil has 3 million Brazilian immigrants now. Not the city, the state of São Paulo. Russia has been moving into the area heavily. On the 1st of December 2008, Russia had joint military exercises with Venezuela. Cuba said they wanted in. They didn't. As I told some of you yesterday, in mid-December 2008, so almost 2 years ago to the day, in the mid of December, they ended the exercises by the simulated occupation of an ex-American base in Panama. And Venezuela, formally in the beginning of 2009, requested Russian help for extension of its military runways so that they can be used in Cuba, the Cuban runways, so they can be used by Russian strategic bombers. It's done already. The Russians not only did it, but paid for it. Okay? So there's a rush from both the Russians and the Chinese as well. Moreover, of course, the French decided that this was a great opportunity to sell Rafale Dassault fighter bombers to Brazil. And they sold in a thing called Projet Rafale 36 fighter bombers. No one really knows the cost. This is between Lula and Sarkozy, but the estimated cost is something between 10 and 15 billion dollars. Well, euros, actually. I think the trade was carried out in euros. The French also sold to Brazil 5 submarines, and Brazil officially announced that it's producing its own nuclear-powered submarine with nuclear technology of Brazil in 2011. The Germans moved in and sold 3 German nuclear-powered submarines to South Africa. The Angolans immediately reacted, this is 2009, by saying, we want a navy too. And the Americans said, we'll take care of this. One of the Nordic countries, I'm not going to tell which, French, actually wrote a report for one of the Nordic countries on the security situation off the coast of a small line of coast. Namibia, Angola, and the Congo. This stretch is about 3,000 kilometers long. Now, the coast of Angola, the Congo, and Namibia has, for protection, 150 so-called ninjas, call themselves ninjas, Angolans. So there's 150 Angolan soldiers to protect 3,500 kilometers of coast in 3 countries using 2 Korean frigates. So my point here is this. You've all read in newspapers that there's an arms race going on between Colombia and Venezuela. Think big, this is a much bigger arms race. Let me give you an idea of the local perception before I wrap this up. Perhaps the most renowned, certainly the most, to my mind, solid theoretician, geopolitical theoretician in Brazil is a man called Luiz Alberto Muniz Bandeira. And in 2008, in the end of 2008, Muniz Bandeira formally presented a communication to the Superior War School, the top war staff school in Brazil, which was published by the Ministry of Defense in Brazil, in which he said, and I'm again translating loosely, the restoration of the American Fourth Fleet certainly implies different strategic interests, diverse strategic interests of the United States. But what makes it clear that its real intent, and this is answering here, he wrote, is the fact that the Fourth Fleet was given to Counter-Admiral Joseph Kernan, the top commander of the US Navy SEALs, United States Navy, Sea, Air and Land Forces, constituted by Special Operation Forces of the US War Navy, which are used, he wrote, Muniz Bandeira, in direct actions and special reconnaissance missions capable of carrying out non-conventional warfare, internal defense in the interior, and anti-terrorist operations. One of the integral elements of the Fourth Fleet, Muniz Bandeira wrote at the end of 2008, and this was published by the Ministry of Defense, is an amphibious assault ship, USS Kearsarge, LHD-3, the main mission of which is the embarkation, dislodgement and disembarkment of forces anywhere in the world, used as, and he's quoting the Americans, an expedition, part of an expeditionary strike group, a military concept introduced by the US in the beginning of the 90s, and which are highly mobile and self-sustained forces to execute expeditionary missions anywhere in the globe. This is Muniz Bandeira writing. There, and he puts in inverted commas, humanitarian missions started in Santa Marta in Colombia in coordination with the General Command of the Armed Forces and the National Army of Colombia. This is what Fidel Castro had referred to in his shout. Muniz Bandeira then goes on in an article, I won't go down to this, by saying this is a modernized version of the US Monroe Doctrine. It is clear, he wrote, this is 2009 publication, that the United States, with control of the seas and space, never stopped having warships traveling international seas off the coast of South America. Although the Fourth Fleet, created in 1943 during the Second World War, was officially extinct in the 50s. Its restoration does not mean a bigger change in military activities of the United States in the South Atlantic, wrote Muniz Bandera, was actually a very balanced man, wants 38% of its global commerce takes place with Southern Hemisphere countries, US commerce. 34% of the oil it imports comes from the region, which is an exaggeration, and 2/3 of the ships that transit through the Panama Canal are destined to the US. And then he says, the conflict ends, and I'll end with this quotation of his, and the conflict of Russia and Georgia shows that the arc of crisis that Zbigniew Brzezinski says run from Pakistan to Ethiopia around the greater Middle East is much bigger than that, and it includes all of Central Asia and the Caucasus. Facing this situation, wrote Muniz Bandera in 2009, the geopolitical importance of South America augmented even more within the framework of the security strategy of the United States, trying to look for alternative sources of gas and oil from more stable situations. Halford Mackinder, in his conference on the geographical pivot of history in 1904, he says, brought out that the development of great potentialities in South America could have a decisive influence over the international system and reinforce the United States of America, or perhaps Germany, if Germany could, this is 1904, challenge the Monroe Doctrine in an effective manner. He ends his speech to the War College by saying, Muniz Bandera, a second Cold War was started, and it involves South America, where the penetration of the United States is becoming a factor of instability and disquiet. The high degree of turbulence, internal and external resistance and opposition of the majority of governments to the will of the United States clearly denotes the weakening of its hegemony in a region where up until now its fiat had the force of law, and it repercutes deeply over, has a deep repercussion over its global strategy in the sense of imposing a Pax Americana, i.e. the preservation of an extension of a friendly international order to our security, our prosperity, and our principles, following, he ends in a Sibylline way, the directives of the Project for the New American Century. Project for the New American Century, of course, is the manifesto of the neocons. By 2009, Obama was already there. It wasn't the neocons anymore. So the claim is that this is an extension of the neocon strategy, which is a reinforcement of the Monroe doctrine of the early 19th century. Another Brazilian, on the 5th of June 2009, in Diário de Pernambuco, one of the most read newspapers in South America, wrote an article which was, it's called Brazilian Oil in the South Atlantic, which was published on the homepage of the Ministry of Education of Brazil, republished, which claimed the Atlantic Ocean is the first in terms of the circulation of goods and has the biggest relevance in strategic terms. The sea to the south was explored by Portuguese shippers more than 5 centuries ago, who established themselves on the coast of Africa and America. And after a long historical processes, from these countries, from these coasts, countries were created when Portuguese is spoken, which now, he wrote, if pushed by Brazil, my stress, will consolidate a community which will become more and more important in the world scenario. In the post-financial crisis world, Brazil will emerge as an economic, incontestable power and will have to face off different new challenges. First, to maintain a policy of approximation with its neighbors in South America, to give the foundation and amplify Mercosur, and at the same time as promoting an ampler relationship with West African countries, and also to fortify its interests in the amplification of the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, which exists since 15 years ago. Involves 8 Portuguese-speaking countries and maybe 30 countries with an observer status, including now Australia. Now, it's very interesting that he then makes the suggestion that Brazil should get together with its neighbors and Portuguese-speaking countries, namely Argentina and Angola, and establish a military base in Cabo Verde, up there, connecting the Sentinel archipelago I told you about in the beginning. Very close, he wrote, to the most important routes, navigation routes, connecting the north to the south. Our initiative, he wrote, and the Ministry of Education of Brazil republished this, would not, this is July 2009, would not cause military imbalance, because Lajes in the Azores is where the United States, together with NATO, have for a very long time held an American base. And the Falkland Islands, under British domination, he wrote, this is mid-2009, as long as it is within the interests of the nations of that organization, NATO, can receive important military installations which will serve the interests of northern countries. We can complement NATO in Cabo Verde, he ends with. Now, again, there's a context to this. 2009, I mentioned this yesterday, the President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, signed a new policy of national defense with Brazil, dividing Brazil up into 2 areas, the Blue Amazon, north, where coastal protection was absolutely essential with the creation of a green water navy, which will be either the first or the second biggest in the world, because no one knows what the Chinese one is going to be. For the Yangtze and the Yellow River, they're building one as well. And on the south, this is the northern Blue Amazon, and then this is the other coast of Brazil. The objective is supremacy and hegemony. These are the words used in their 2005 strategy. In fact, they divided into 3 points. 1, to create a climate of peace and cooperation in its borders. 2, to intensify exchanges with armed forces of friendly countries, mostly in South America and Western Africa, by contributing to regional integration based on an industry of defense. And 2, 3, and last, to participate actively in decisions on the destiny of Antarctica, including the capacity of power projection for external operations, by creating new partnerships with friendly countries to develop technologies which are of interest for defense, by participating in missions, humanitarian and peace missions, according to national interests, and by participating in international fora of decision-making, obviously thinking of the UN Security Council, so as to amplify the negotiation capacity of the country. I'm quoting directly from the 2005 approved Brazilian document, which is really a map. This is not very surprisingly echoed, and I'll save you from listening to my translation, from what the Argentinian Minister of Defense gave first as an interview and then wrote as a paper, which I quote extensively here, and by what the Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, published on the 27th May 2010 on their homepage, which I'll quote. say the known rivalry in football between Brazil and Argentina, even in this year, 2010, of a World Cup, was left behind in the name of science. The two countries, Brazil and Argentina, says the Itamaraty page, joined in the development project of a satellite so as to monitor the seas, the observation of which is essential for climate change observation. Those of you who know about politics will know what this means. The Brazilian Space Agency, together with the National Commission for Space Activities of Argentina, are going to build a Sabia-Mar satellite for the global observation of oceans and monitoring the Atlantic in the proximity of both countries. The investment is, it's not very big, $140 million. And the preliminary test will say, claims that the satellite will be operational by 2014. One of the means to do so, it says in the Itamaraty page, is through the rocket Cyclone 4. And the rocket is an Argentinian rocket which will be launched in Maranhão, in Alcântara, in Brazil. It's clearly a dual-use one, and they've tested in the same July 2010 as this was being published, a laser cannon that can shoot down satellites from non-friendly countries, pretty much like China had done a few years before. As before Lula, Celso Laffer, to see that this is not Lula, this is not the Bolivarians, this is not the left-right. Celso Laffer, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the one before Lula, said the Brazil-Argentina connection is inverting bilateral relations. They're not a factor of uncertainty in strategic balance in South America, and are now, on the contrary, he wrote, 2001, this is right-wing government, center-right government. It became, on the contrary, a guarantee of peace and stability in the region. The panorama is changing. Brazil and Argentina are building their own GPS system, alternative to the American one and to the one the European Union is building based on the French Guiana satellites. I think 24 satellites are doing it. Now, let me finish by saying, this is not really new. I mean, in the 1960s, Portugal, when the colonial war started in Angola, etc., asked, under the edges of Article 5 of the NATO, the Atlantic Treaty, NATO help for containing insurgent movements in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. 1 year before, this is 61, in 1960, France had asked for NATO help in Algeria. NATO said, we're going to think about it. Portugal asked, NATO told Portugal no, and told France yes, and actually helped in Algeria. In the 70s, apartheid South Africa proposed officially the creation of an entity called SATO, the South Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO didn't even bother to respond to this, because it was totally unacceptable for NATO to help an apartheid regime in South Africa. In the 70s, in which in the mid-year of the 70s, 75 was the annus horribilis for the Western Bloc. This is the year in which the 5 Portuguese African colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, Cabo Verde, and those fell to the Soviet side at the same time as Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia did as well as in South America, rollback started happening with Nicaraguan radical groups taking power. It was a big disaster. I mean, it would have been a shot in the foot, to say the least, to for NATO to get together with South Africa. 2009, Venezuela, Hugo Chavez formally proposed to Brazil, Lula, the creation of SATO, the same name. And Brazil said this is not the right time for it, so as to guarantee security in the area. Let me finish by saying, I hope to have made clear to you that the situation is degrading empirically. If I haven't, let me tell you this. In May 2010, the now retired Director General for National Security Policy of the German Ministry of Defense, Hans Röber, published in the very officious German Council of Foreign Relations magazine, 30-page article, I can give you the link for this, called Vexing Nuclear Questions, Brazil's Development, Covert Development of Nuclear Weapons, claiming that Brazil is covertly developing nuclear weapons for this sake. Now, is this true, or is it a diplomatic bid? It's probably both. 3 weeks afterwards, Brazil, as a rotating member of the Security Council, voted against the 4th round of sanctions against Ahmadinejad, creating an outcry all over. I mean, why are you guys doing this? So maybe the Germans came out with this information of Brazil developing nuclear weapons so as to try and stop Brazil shutting them down, name and shame. Because in fact, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is becoming toothless, not only by Ahmadinejad, but by Brazil and all the other countries that are developing. I hope to also have shown you how political leaders, journalists, and agitprop movements have actually been constructing this feeling of insecurity in an area which is a natural extension of NATO. NATO should not only have an association with an eventual SATO, federal or confederal, that has to be constructed for safety, security purposes, but mostly, I think, to my mind, both could and perhaps should fuse, although I think that's difficult, into an ATO, an Atlantic Treaty Organization, the only thing that will give us security from terrorism, for energy distribution, for political radical movements, either of a Marxist or of an Islamist kind, in a world that is becoming ever and ever more complex. Thank you very much.